Harry Houdini wowed audiences with his daredevil escapes and mystifying illusions. But for all his success, he had only one true failure. Try as he might, he couldn't have any children, and this led him to a truly chilling act. Before becoming the legendary Harry Houdini, the magician was simply known as Eric Weiss. Hailing from Budapest, Hungary, Eric and his family immigrated to the US in the hopes of capturing the American dream. But sadly, their new chapter was more like a nightmare. At only 4 years old, Eric watched as his entire family started to fall apart. To begin with, his father faced unemployment and a tragic cancer diagnosis. As the head of the household struggled to hold his head above water, the family barely scraped by. But as Eric grew into an enterprising young boy, he effortlessly slipped into any role that would pay him an extra dollar. That is, until he was struck by inspiration. In 1890, Eric picked up the autobiography of the French magician Robert Houdin. He devoured the text, learning as much as he could. This is why he gave himself the name Harry Houdini, an homage to one of the greats that came before him. The dramatic name change was a step in the right direction, but deep in his heart there was still a void that longed to be filled. You see, although Houdini seemed like he was all work and no play, he also wanted to find a partner, someone with whom he could weather life's nasty storms. Luckily, his wish came true. In 1894, a beautiful young girl crossed Houdini's path, and it was impossible to look away. Her name was Bess, an 18-year-old fellow performer who sang and danced. Like everything else in his life, Houdini had made up his mind about Bess, his feelings propelling him toward one of his most important decisions yet. 3 weeks after meeting Bess, he married her. Later, in speaking of his marriage, he said, "This is the one shackle I don't want to escape from." Houdini took his life very seriously, his romance, his family, and of course the secrets of his craft. But before he could fully trust Bess with these secrets, he asked her for one very important thing. On one fateful night, he led both his brother and Bess to the middle of a bridge. He waited for a nearby church to ring its midnight bells. Once the ringing ceased, he made both of his closest confidants swear an oath that they would never reveal the secrets behind his acts. Placing all of his trust in Bess, Houdini felt secure. He could now rely on his wife as a professional colleague as well. The two of them went on tour with a traveling circus, proudly showing off their act Metamorphosis. But sadly, their dreams of fame and fortune went unfounded. The situation seemed downright hopeless. Audiences just weren't flocking to their shows in a way that he had hoped. The only way forward was to change his performance entirely and give the people something that they had never seen before. Then Houdini came up with his most brilliant idea yet. He introduced handcuffs into his act, an object that most people associated with terror. His performance was pure escapology. He had to escape the intricate shackles that bound him. To audiences, it would seem like an impossible feat, but that's what made his successful escape all the more awe-inspiring. Houdini took his escape act on a worldwide tour, but that wasn't the most impressive part. The magician worked hard to get his name out there. For every city he visited, he distributed flyers with his illustrated portrait and performed in buzzworthy publicity stunts. He became known as the Handcuff King, and soon his shows started to sell out. Still, he had yet to conquer the most important city of all. In 1904, Houdini's plan hit a real snag. At 30 years old, he arrived in London, a city bursting at the seams with its own vaudeville delights. But the audiences weren't as eager to see him as he'd thought. In fact, most people had never even heard of Houdini and his spectacular handcuff act. Unwilling to admit defeat, the magician had to think on his feet and act as quickly as possible. Determined to conquer London, Houdini made a bold call. To get everyone's attention, he staged a demonstration smack dab in the middle of Scotland Yard. With his trusty act in tow, he had the element of surprise. His talents shocked authorities and onlookers alike, puzzling them to no end. This ingenious publicity worked wonders for him, and the consequences were staggering. Audiences couldn't get enough of him. He quickly became one of the most famous performers in the entire nation. After all of his tireless efforts, his finances turned to pure gold. He started ranking in a whopping $300 per week, which is equal to about $9,300 today. It was time to finally reap his rewards, and the giddy magician had no qualms about splurging. He bought real estate in New York and spoiled his mother with enviable presents. On one occasion, he even presented her with a dress that he claimed had once belonged to Queen Victoria herself. He had achieved the financial success that he had always dreamed of. But to the ambitious Houdini, it still wasn't enough. In order to up the ante and keep audiences interested, he decided to put his life at risk in a horrifying way. Houdini decided to try his famous handcuff act underwater. To prepare for these dangerous performances, he practiced holding his breath by submerging himself in ice-cold bath water. His record time? 3 minutes and 45 seconds. What happened next was nothing short of extraordinary. Harry Houdini was a very singular performer as he took vaudeville outside. He didn't just perform in the theatre like every other magician, he took his new show to Bridges, where he had stripped down to his underclothes, shackled himself, and then threw himself into the watery depths. Crowds of spectators lined the banks cheering for him as he rose to the surface, free and unharmed. But these incredibly successful performances caused an unforeseen wrinkle in his plans. Houdini's public spectacles inspired others to do the same. Copycat performers took his idea and ran with it. Well, he wasn't about to let them get away with that. In order to ruin his rivals' reputations, he challenged them. On one such occasion, in September 1905, Houdini faced off against Boudini in Manhattan. Both magicians threw themselves into the murky Hudson River, disappearing into the darkness. The competing magicians worked feverishly to free their wrists and ankles, but there could only be one winner. After 1 minute and 30 seconds, Houdini broke the surface and claimed victory. His rival, on the other hand, almost drowned. This life or death performance invigorated crowds with its originality, and the cheers resounded in the open air. Mastering these underwater acts lit a fire beneath Houdini, and he became obsessed with making the stunt even more life-threatening. He squeezed himself into an oversized milk can filled with water. It was terrifyingly claustrophobic and provided him with limited mobility. He put out clever posters that read, "Failure means a drowning death." Moreover, before starting the act, he invited the audience to try holding their breath for the entire time he remained submerged. This milk can escape in particular became an absolute sensation. But sometimes his stunts went horribly wrong. Houdini became a master of endurance and control. He managed to navigate pain, panic, and fear almost effortlessly, but he couldn't always control the world around him. Once in New York, he went into the water and smashed his head on the ocean floor. Even more terrifying, he almost drowned in Mississippi when he misjudged how strong the current actually was. There was always a risk, but that's exactly what made his work so exciting. And at this point, he still hadn't discovered his most famous act of all. By 1912, too many other magicians were copying his milk can act, and so Houdini decided to raise the stakes once more. This time, the act had a terrifying name to match: Chinese water torture cell. This is one of the stunts he is most remembered by. Suspended by his ankles, he hung upside down in a rectangular glass box filled with water. But there was a horrifying dark side to this particular stunt. The Chinese water torture cell was an incredibly painful show. The weight of the water, as well as Houdini's position, put immense pressure on his head. If this bothered him, he didn't show it, and he continued to escape night after night. And then the winds of change whipped his life into a frenzy once again. In Times Square, he hung himself upside down from a great height, tied up in a straitjacket. Stunts like this attracted an overwhelming sea of people, their eyes clinging to the hanging man in the sky. But Houdini also had another trick up his sleeve. He took his notorious straitjacket performance to the doorsteps of newspaper companies. In fact, he strung himself up right outside their front windows. It was a brilliant move. Photographers simply had to poke their head out of the window to get a snapshot of him in action. Even better, he often gave them headline suggestions for the story. Houdini certainly maintained his position as the #1 entertainer, but sadly, he paid a startling price for his taxing career. A price so high, it would come back to bite him in later years. Everything he set his mind to, Houdini excelled at. In addition to his live shows, he also became a movie star and a pilot. He'd had a hand in every honeypot. By 1910, he was absolutely exhausted. At 36 years old, he'd already been in the game for almost 20 years. Simply put, he wasn't the young man he once was. Mentally and physically drained by his intense work, Houdini even looked much older. His hair was turning grey. And then tragedy struck in 1913. Houdini fainted after hearing the most devastating news. The woman he'd worked so hard to impress, his mother Cecilia, had passed away. But that wasn't the only source of heartache. He and his wife Bess wanted to start a family of their own. But sadly, Bess couldn't bear any children. Instead, Houdini eased his disappointments by entertaining young children in hospitals. Houdini was a master of masking his own pain, and yet he still couldn't give up performing. In 1915, he came up with a stunt so dangerous, he almost perished. Houdini decided to try being buried alive. He lowered himself into a hole dug 6 feet deep and was buried beneath the dirt. The stunt did not go as planned. As he struggled to dig himself out, Houdini's strength wavered and panic set in. As he got closer to the top, he cried out for help. He only managed to break the surface with one hand before falling unconscious. Losing oxygen beneath the earth, he had to be rescued by assistants. They rushed forward and dragged him out of the grave. Later on, he wrote in his diary expressing the sheer terror of that moment, saying, "The weight of the earth is killing." In reality, Houdini's greatest enemy was only himself. He just never knew when to quit. Oddly enough, his horrific end did not come from a failed stunt, but something else entirely. In 1926, while on tour in Montreal, he welcomed a fan into his dressing room. It seemed like an innocent meeting, but it ended in an unspeakable tragedy. According to witnesses, a fan had asked Houdini if he could endure punches to the stomach without experiencing pain. Unsurprisingly, the magician wholeheartedly agreed. That's when the worst happened. Before Houdini even had time to brace himself, the fan pulled back his arm and punched him multiple times. The sudden strike blindsided Houdini, who had been reclining on the couch, and the blows definitely hurt. Still, for the great Houdini, the show went on. He performed through the evening, ignoring both his pain and fever. But despite being unable to sleep, he refused to go to a doctor. This was a fatal mistake. 2 days later, the magician was in the worst shape of his life. By the time he sought medical attention, he had a fever of 102 and severe appendicitis. Surgery was essential to his survival, but frustratingly, he decided to do his show instead. Sadly, it would be his very last moment on stage. With a fever of 104, he performed through the pain, even passing out mid-show and then continuing on. Somehow, Houdini made it all the way to the end of the show, but once the curtains were closed, he collapsed. By the time he made it to the hospital, he was certain that he would pull through. After all, he dodged his mortality time and time again. But this time was different. It was already too late. On October 31st, 1926, Harry Houdini uttered his last words, and they were so disturbing it's unforgettable. After days of ceaseless agony, the 52-year-old Houdini reportedly said, "I'm tired of fighting. I do not want to fight anymore." The legendary magician, who had seemed immortal and even godlike, had passed away too soon. Still, the details of the actual cause of his demise were pretty blurry. Did the punches cause Houdini's ruptured appendix? Or did they simply aggravate or cover up a pre-existing condition? The answer will never be clear. But one thing is certain. Houdini might have had a chance if he had only attended to his own pain. His stubbornness was the real nail in the coffin. But before he passed away, Houdini made one last request of his beloved wife, Bess. Still stubborn about debunking spiritualism, Houdini and Bess came up with a secret code. After passing, he agreed to communicate his presence if there was ever a way to do so. He would send her the message, "Rosabelle, believe," a code derived from their favorite song, Rosabelle. For the next decade, Bess religiously held a Halloween seance in the hopes of communicating with her late husband, but the results only yielded more heartbreak. Every year, Bess got her hopes up, and every single year she walked away from the seance disappointed. Houdini's wife was his greatest secret keeper, but years after he passed, she let loose one of his most harrowing secrets of all. As we already know, the couple weren't able to have any children of their own, but in his own special way, Houdini did have a child, an imaginary son that he'd named after his own father. Bess later confessed that her husband would write her daily letters about their son's accomplishments and progress. It was his saddest illusion yet. His detailed letters only ceased once their son achieved the highest station possible, President of the United States. Harry Houdini was an undeniable daredevil with an extraordinary life. In the end, he left behind an incredible legacy of strength, creativity, and perseverance, along with the kind of courage that is still admired many years after he is gone. Thanks for watching History Expose. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.